Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Phyrexia All Will Be One set review. We are moving on to black now. It's been a little bit for me, so you have to forgive me if things are a little different here, but we're just going to get started talking about this stuff. First off, we have Annihilating Glare. We have a 1-mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay 4 or sacrifice an artifact or creature. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. This is a nice little removal spell in the vein of Bone Splinters and the like. We have seen a very similar card before. I think it was 4, but it cost 3 and a black. And it was just destroy target creature. So this is, we've very much seen this card before. It's a little bit better now, but a Bone Splinters effect, pretty good stuff. Seems to be a lot of tokens running around if you're like a black-white deck, so this would be probably a fairly solid removal spell. Next up, we have Bilious Skull Dweller. This is a 1-mana 1/1 Phyrexian insect creature with a Death Touch and Toxic 1. This is very nice for an aggressive toxic strategy because it means that your opponent is going to have to trade for this creature with one of their creatures or take that poison counter every turn. So this could be also like a black-white aggressive strategy that you could build towards, is the Corrupted strategy, that, and this would be a nice little bit playery in that. Next up, we have the black version of the Twilight Cycle. This is black and X for an instant. Up to 1 target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. If X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is quite nice. This actually probably has a potential for constructed playability. A scaling removal spell that can also just reanimate something. Like, if you do this for... No, you have to do 5 or more to reanimate something. So it's never going to get those little reanimations, but like if you do it for 5 or more, you're getting a decent-sized removal spell, like killing a Shieldred and getting back your own Shieldred, is the theory for me. Now that is 6 mana to do that, but so maybe not worth it. Maybe you'd much rather have just a Doomblade or something. But I could see this being run as like a singleton or something in a like a Rakdos shell maybe. Next up we have Duress. Seen this card a million times. I don't really rate it in limited, particularly when I think what we're looking at is a more aggressive set. So, yeah, that's it. Moving on to the next card, we have Vat of Rebirth. This is a 1-mana black artifact. Whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Vat of Rebirth. Pay 3, tap it. Remove 4 oil counters from Vat of Rebirth. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. This is quite good for a sacrifice deck. Yeah, this is quite good for like a sacrifice deck, a token style deck, because you can lose a bunch of tokens and then get back one of your real creatures, right? Maybe something you discarded, maybe something that was killed. That's very solid. And creatures will die in limited. So, getting this down, and then just having it as that late game threat We haven't seen anything that messes with the graveyard as of yet. So we will see if there are some things that can shut this down, but we haven't seen anything yet. So next up we have Whisper of the Dross. This is a 1 mana black instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Proliferate. Interesting. So this plays into like a blue-black proliferate strategy. I think -1/-1 is perhaps too marginal. I'd have to look at, like, we've seen quite a few 1/1 or X1 creatures. So maybe this has a place. I think you probably have to be getting value out of the proliferate, because if you're just killing a token with this, it's not worth a card. So I feel like you have to be getting a value out of the proliferate with this one. Next up, we have Anoint with Affliction. This is a 2 mana instant. Exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less. Corrupted, exile that creature instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So this is a almost Fatal Push style effect. Why do I say Fatal Push? Because it's Fatal Push in the templating, not in the actual effect. The actual effect is more like what's it called? The Eldraine removal spell. I forget what it was called. It was something cheesy. The reason I say it's Fatal Push-esque in the templating is because this is something you need to be careful about. Now, Arena is usually pretty good about calling this out. If you play on Arena, but it will let you cast it because it doesn't say target creature with mana value 3 or less. It says target creature if it has mana value 3 or less. Now, the distinction there is you can target anything with this. There doesn't need to be a creature with mana value 3 or less on the battlefield for you to cast this spell. You can cast it targeting your opponent's 12-drop. It's not going to do anything unless your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Or you need... So it is important to keep in mind that you can cast this anytime, particularly if you were playing like the blue-black proliferate and your opponent, the blue-black proliferate deck, and you have something that like proliferates when you cast a non-creature spell or something like that. You can cast this even if there isn't a... There does need to be a valid target, but that valid target doesn't need to meet the criteria of having mana value 3 or less. So, if that makes sense. You could also cast this targeting something that has mana value 3 or greater, and then give your opponent a poison counter at instant speed, and or up to 3, more than 3 or 3 or more poison counters at instant speed. Get them up to that level, and this resolves and will exile the target. That's probably more niche, but it is possible. I think the first case where you don't necessarily have a valid target, but you do want to cast a spell to trigger your non-creature spell stuff is more likely. Next up, we have... I mean, I should go back and say real quick that it's a good removal spell, right? If your opponent... Like, if you can get that corrupted, then it's a great removal spell. If you can't get that on average, then it's still pretty good. Next up, we have Blightbelly Rat. This is a 2 mana, 2/2 Phyrexian rat creature with Toxic 1, and when it dies, proliferate. Yay! It's a 2-mana 2/2. It's a Grizzly Bear, Toxic, and a Death Trigger. That's, nice. Um, with oil counters being the primary counters on creatures, this is going to be a proactive effect that you're going to want for yourself. Like this will put, for example, this would put 2 counters on your Vat of Rebirth for dying. Excuse me. Very much excuse me. Yeah, I like this card. Like, you can play it in this theoretical sacrifice deck. Notably, there's only one drop in black for creatures. So I don't know how aggressive you can really be here. Well, let's finish off like 2 drops and stuff and see where we're at. So, yeah. Next up, we have Drowning Ichor. This is a 2-mana sorcery. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Proliferate. So this is, again, another sort of like removal spell that fits in the same vein. It's very similar to Anoint with Affliction in some ways, and in other ways it's not. It's sort of better. And sort of worse. So -4/-4 is very nice. It kills a lot of what we've seen. I don't think there's been very much at all with more than 4 toughness. So this is quite strong. Proliferate being tacked onto the end is very nice as well. Yeah. A solid card. Next up, we have Fleshless Gladiator. This is a 2-mana 2/2 Phyrexian skeleton, because they can make your skeleton Phyrexian. And it has Corrupted. Pay 3, return, that is 2 and 1 black. Return Fleshless Gladiator from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. You lose 1 life. Activate only if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. I don't like this card. You're paying 3, you're losing a life, and you're returning this thing tapped. Like, it's free sacrifice fodder, I guess. But paying life and a large amount of mana, I don't really like it. I think it's a little too vanilla for what it does. I think that if you're getting corrupted, you might as well just focus in on a more toxic focused strategy than this thing. Yeah, that's what we've got. Next up, we have Necrogen Communion. This is a 2-mana enchantment aura. Enchant creature you control. Enchanted creature has Toxic 2. When enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. Okay. So, important part about this saying enchant creature you control is, I believe, if you lose control of the creature for whatever reason, this aura will fall off. quote unquote, it will be put into the graveyard because it is no longer a creature you control. It also means you can't put it on your opponent's creatures, though why you'd want to... I guess return that card to the battlefield under your control is the reason you would want to. Like, you can't... They don't want this to be played in such a way that you sort of throw it on an opponent's creature and then remove that creature and have it come back to you. But they could have done that with that line of text elsewhere as well. I think that more importantly, if your opponent gains control of the creature, for whatever reason, this falls off, it loses the toxic 2, and what have you. Next up, we have Offer Immortality. This is a 2-mana instant. Target creature gains Death Touch and indestructible until end of turn. I believe that we have literally seen this card before, but under a different name. There have been several variations on this. I don't quite recall what it was called, but yeah, it's a solid little trick. Not great, but if you get it, you can definitely use it, right? Next up, we have Pestilent Siphoner. This is a 2-mana, 1/1 creature, Phyrexian insect, with flying and toxic 1. Again, an aggressive, toxic creature. Maybe this is a little bit less aggressive. Yeah, it's an evasive toxic threat. I think that if you're going for a toxic win, like a poison win, I think this is pretty solid. Other than that, like a 1/1 for 2 is a little weak, so I don't know that that's necessarily that's gonna do it for you. It might be. We have seen a lot of smaller creatures, so that might be. This might be effective. I think we've seen a ton of big stuff in the air. We've seen a couple things that are relatively large, but anyway, moving along, we have Scheming Aspirant. This is a 2-mana, 1/3 Phyrexian Advisor. Whenever you proliferate, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is a definite payoff for that Dimir proliferate build. It's hard for me to say whether or not this will be significant. I think it is something that is important to keep in mind, and this may be one of the standout cards, because it can just sit back and win the game slowly or very, very quickly if you have a lot of proliferate stuff. Yeah, I'm thinking this is going to be a solid pick. It has that just like deceptive nature of like it doesn't necessarily do anything on its own, but like if you have a couple of spells that have proliferate tacked on the end of them, like this Drown and Ichor, Whisper of the Dross, all of a sudden those are now coming along with proliferate and drain your opponent for 2, which is quite nice. Next up, we have Shieldred's Edict. This is one. This is a 2-mana instant. Choose one. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. Each opponent sacrifices a creature token, or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. I think there's just a glut of low-cost removal here, and this is probably the weakest. An Edict is generally fine, but and this is like a very sort of narrowish edict, right? You get to, like, if your opponent's running a bunch of creature tokens in one creature, you can edict away that one creature that's relevant. Or their planeswalker that's relevant. But I think that in the face of stuff like Anoint with Affliction and Drown in Ichor, like, this is probably the weakest removal spell, and we have like 3 different removal spells in black at 2 mana. This is, and this being third on the list, that's a little dubious for this thing's playability for me. Next up, we have Vran, Executioner Thane. This is a 2-mana, 2/2 legendary creature, Phyrexian vampire. Whenever one or more other creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. This bad. This is a rare. Whew. Okay. Blood Artist effects are now too strong and rare quality. Yes, it's for 2. But once per turn, like, you can get 2 Blood Artist triggers in a turn pretty easily. Okay? And oftentimes you will. Just like combat. So, I guess the way to think about this is much less a Blood Artist effect and more like just a nice little combat support piece. Yeah. This is just, I have a very difficult time seeing how this card is going to be good. Because it's like your opponent is incentivized to kill as much of your stuff as possible at once, I guess, is the thing. Like, if you go to combat, swing, and they block something and it dies, this triggers, and they're like, okay, well, you've already triggered that thing, so I'm going to go and remove a bunch of your stuff now. Yeah. I'm not a big fan. I could be wrong, and this could be like the most broken thing on earth, but I doubt that it is. I think it's fairly weak. This is, we've seen Blood Artist, Zulaport Cutthroat, stuff like that at lower rarities, and it's been fine, right? So this being higher rarity, being limited to once per turn, but triggering for more, don't really care, or don't really think it's very good. Next up, we have Ambulatory Edifice. This is a 3-mana, 3/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian construct. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2 life. When you do, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This is okay. Again, this feels a little weak. This is in the interesting enters the battlefield camp, right? You don't have to pay the 2 life, but it can, like, paying the 2 life could if it's going, you can pay the 2 life if it's going to kill something, right? So in sort of the same way as the 4 mana 2/5 in blue, this is sort of the interesting enters the battlefield ability. Like, is this worth it? It's tough to say. I don't think this card is very good. I think it's nice to have, maybe sometimes, but you're not gonna love having an ambulatory edifice, right? It's there, is more what it is. Next up, we have Bonepicker Scourge. This is a 3 mana 2/2 Phyrexian Imp with flying and corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, Bonepicker Scourge has Death Touch and Lifelink. If you can get corrupted, this is a very nice card. A 3 mana 2/2 flying Death Touch Lifelink is very nice. It's evasive. Even if they block it, they're going to have to trade with it at a minimum, and then you gain life. Lifelink, very nice. But if you can't get that corrupted, a 3 mana 2/2 flyer is just subpar. And that is what it is. So, it all hinges on whether or not you can get 3 poison counters on an opponent and turn this on. And then we're sort of in the realm of like, hey, this is like not doing poison. Like, this is attacking my opponent's actual life total instead of doing unhealable damage to them. And I'm sort of splitting my strategy. Toxic sort of helps mitigate that to a certain extent because it doesn't take away the normal damage that your infect creatures are doing. But even still, like, focusing on those 2 different aspects is a little tough for me to justify. Next up, we have Chittering Skitterling. This is a 3 mana 1/4 Phyrexian Rat with Corrupted. Sacrifice an artifact or a creature, draw a card. Activate only if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters and only once each turn. Interesting. Draw a card. Very powerful. I think this activated ability is very powerful. Again, it matters if you can get those 3 poison counters, which in black, what we have to get there so far is not very much. Like, we have this Bilious Skull Dweller, which is nice for getting a couple of or nice for getting like a poison counter, maybe 2 on there. Blight Belly Rat. Which is, again, maybe nice for getting a poison counter on your opponent. And the Pestilent Siphoner, which is also okay for getting a poison counter on your opponent. Like, I think this is the best chance. It very much feels like you're going to be trading and playing very aggressively with your creatures, trying to trade off and prevent yourself from getting poison counters to stave off this corrupted ability. This corrupted trigger, right? This threshold on there. But yeah, if you get corrupted, like, if you get the corrupted setup, this is a very nice thing for a sacrifice build. You can just, like, continuously You can sacrifice stuff. Like, if you're playing like black-white, you get tokens, and then you sack the tokens, you draw cards. Generate some pretty nice advantage there. Next up, we have Cutthroat Centurion. This is a 3-mana, 2/2 artifact creature, Phyrexian warrior. With sacrifice another artifact or creature, Cutthroat Centurion gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Activate only once each turn. These hard once per turns really, really bother me. You could just put some other cost on there. I don't like... I really don't like that text. Yeah. The +2/+2 is fine. This card very much feels like if you don't have the ability to go for Corrupted. Now, the problem is everything little in black is going to have Toxic. I think we saw, like, Fleshless Gladiator was the only thing without Toxic. And that's just a vanilla 2/2 if you're not going for if you're not going for any poison on your opponent. We have Scheming Aspirant, but that's like in a Proliferate Payoff archetype. We have Vran, that's a rare. So it very much feels like you're gonna have to play for Corrupted. Because a lot of these cards are just not very good if you don't get there. And Cutthroat Centurion isn't very good at all. Yeah, it's just not very good at all. Even if it is, like, it can be very aggressive, it can be a 4/4 swinging consistently, but you're gonna need to add fuel to that fire to bring it forward. So next up, we have Geth, Thane of Contracts. This is a 3-mana, 1 and 2 black. Important. 3/4 legendary creature, Phyrexian zombie. Other creatures you control get -1/-1. Pay 1 and 2 black. Tap it. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would leave the battlefield. Exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. This card... So 3 mana and tap to reanimate it. To reanimate seems very good. The problem is it's destroying your ability to block or otherwise tempo. Play for tempo in the game. It is making every other creature you have worse in order to enable this synergy. So you are going to need to leverage that ability. That second ability. The first ability is killing all your tokens. The mites, if you have any mites at all, this card is actively bad for you, because it means that your mites will all die. Its stat line is not significantly or sufficiently large that it justifies this -1/-1 on all your other stuff. You're really going to have to be playing for a Reanimator deck. So ugh, shite. I don't really like this card. Next up, we have Infectious Inquiry. This is a 3-mana sorcery. You draw 2 cards, and you lose 2 life. Each opponent gets a poison counter. Hey, look! there's a thing that just gives them a poison counter. No need for combat or anything like that. That's the second one we've seen. I like this card. Because this means that if you're playing like a Dimir Proliferate deck, you don't have to get in for combat damage. You can just play an Infectious Inquiry, and then you start killing your opponent with Proliferates. Just ticking up that unhealable damage. Just very nice. 3 mana might be a little expensive for it, but that is the standard for that kind of effect, so we'll see. Next up, we have Caramonix, the Rat King. This is a 3 mana that is 1 and 2 black. Legendary creature, Phyrexian Rat. It is a 3/3. Toxic 1. Other rats you control have Toxic 1. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of rat cards from among them and put revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Real quick, gonna go back and see what is a rat, because I don't remember. We have the Cheering Skitterling as a rat. We have Blightbelly Rat. And so far, that is all the rats. So there are 2 rats. Caramonix, very okay. But you, like, if you, yeah, it's just very okay. A 3 mana 3/3 with Toxic 1 being fine. The rest of it is more difficult to justify. Well, I'll see if there are rats in other colors, but usually not. Usually rats are black. So having just 2 means that this card in limited is probably not going to do anything for you. We will see if there are more later, but more later also means that they are expensive rats, which is weird. Next up, we have Phyrexian Arena. You've seen this card. This card is good in limited. It's also good in constructed. We all know it. We all love it. It's Phyrexian Arena. Enjoy. Next up, we have Stinging Hivemaster. This is a 3 mana, 3/2 creature, Phyrexian Warlock with Toxic 1, and when it dies, create a Mite. Okay. Not great. Not terrible. This plays in the black-white sacrifice deck, or, well, if it's black, I don't know if it's black-white or something like that. Probably black-white. Mites and Toxic. It's okay. Next up, we have Vraska's Fall. This is a 3 mana instant. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker and gets a poison counter. This is another Edict, another removal spell. Wow, there's a lot of these. So yeah. An Edict here I don't particularly think is good. Like I said before, there's a lot of removal in black. Black being the removal, a heavy removal color typically, but there's a lot of it. And then an Edict in a set with major token strategy, I don't really know about. Just giving your opponent a poison counter outright, I kind of like, but yeah, It's a little bit. I think this is a weak removal spell. This is something you're not going to be very happy about running. Next up, we have Archfiend of the Dross. This is a 4 mana that is 2 and 2 black. 6/6 Phyrexian Demon with flying. Enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from Archfiend of the Dross. Then if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Wow. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. Yikes. I mean, a 4 mana 6/6 flyer? Very solid. I think you... The lose the game text, I guess, probably isn't going to be relevant because this is enough of a clock that your opponent is going to be dead before then. And if you have Proliferate, then you don't really care about it. At 4, this is getting in a minimum of 3 attacks because you play it, it has Summoning Sickness, and then the next turn you remove the first counter and attack with it. So this is getting in a minimum of 3 attacks. That is 6, 12, 18 flying damage. If your opponent can chump it at all, that's kind of bad, but 18 damage on its own plus the drain whenever a creature an opponent controls dies means that this is probably enough of a clock to just knock your opponent out of the game. So I think this is probably pretty solid. The downside of you could potentially lose the game is there, and it's something you should be aware of, but this card looks pretty solid. Next up we have Feed the Infection. This is 4 mana, 3 and a black. Sorcery. You draw 3 cards and you lose 3 life. Corrupted. Each opponent who has 3 or more poison counters loses 3 life. It feels slow to me, but I could be wrong. It feels slow. Draw 3 cards. Pretty good. Lose 3 life. Not so great. If the set is aggressive, really not great. The corrupted on this is just sort of bonus text, though. I think that if that matters, then you're already winning, and you might as well have run something else. It's sort of more of an aggressive bent to the card. Next up, we have Necrosquito. This is a 4 mana, 0/0 Phyrexian Insect. Flying, enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. Gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Necrosquito. I think this is straight up better than the blue one. In every way? Oof. I forget what triggered the blue one. I think it was cast a non-creature spell. So maybe that's more common than like something dying. But then again, like starting as a baseline of a 2/2 for 4. A 4 mana 2/2 flyer that grows, I think, is better than a 4 mana 1/1. Whatever. Yeah, I like this card better than the blue one, but the blue one, they're both kind of like just okay. Next up, we have Phyrexian Obliterator. Well, it's Obliterator. I talked a little bit about this when I talked about the white one. We've had this card. Everybody's played with this card, probably. If you haven't played with this card, sweet card. But essentially works out to be like a 5/5 unblockable, more or less. You do have to be in mono black, essentially, to run it. But yeah, solid card. Next up, we have a Ravenous Necrotitan. This is a 4 mana that is 2 and 2 black, 6/6 Phyrexian Horror. With Corrupted, when Ravenous Necrotitan enters the battlefield, sacrifice a creature unless an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. The way that's templated is somewhat confusing, and I don't particularly like it, because when the ability is prefaced by that Corrupted text, you assume that it doesn't do anything unless an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. But the reality is it does a good thing for you if the opponent has 3 or more poison counters, right? So and Corrupted really is a tag text, right? It's not actual rules text. I believe the way that it would work is, I don't believe they could say if something has a Corrupted ability in rules text on another card, is the way that I see that, because the italic text means that, I forget what it's actually called, but the italics is just a flavor keyword, if you will. So this is a 4 mana 6/6, enters the battlefield, sacrifice a creature. Probably solid, probably pretty solid. Yeah, and then if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, this is just ridiculous. Just a 4 mana 6/6, no downside, no upside either, but like just a 4 mana 6/6. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Next up, we have Sheoldred's Headcleaver. This is a 4 mana 2/4 creature, Phyrexian warrior with Menace and Toxic 2. So Toxic 2 is a bigger toxic number than Toxic 1. In case you were wondering, 2 is greater than 1. But that said, we have not seen anything beyond Toxic 1 up to this point, or Toxic 2 up to this point, right? So this is as high as toxic numbers go. This is Menace, so it's partially evasive. It is a 2/4 though, so I don't think this is going to be any good at all. I think this is going to be something that is a struggle to make work. And when you do, the payoff is 2 poison counters. Right? Which, if it gets you to Corrupted, that's very nice, but if it doesn't, and if it's just extra, or your opponent's never gonna die that way, then this is not very good, right? I think this is a not so good card. Next up, we have Testament Bearer. This is a 4 mana 4/1 Phyrexian warrior. When Testament Bearer dies, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This is an aggressive card that has upside when it dies. It generates a card draw. Now, it is self-mill, so that's a little dangerous. 4 power is quite high for this set, as far as I recall. Or relatively high. It seems decent. Again, like, this seems common level. Not gonna go crazy with anything. Next up, we have Drivnod, Carnage Dominus. This is a 5 mana that is 3 and 2 black. Legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. If creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Then we have Phyrexian Black. Exile 3 target creature cards from your graveyard. Put an indestructible counter on Drivnod, Carnage Dominus. It is an 8/3. An 8/3 That is a big power. That is a big, big power. Um, we've seen a couple of death triggers up to this point. Nothing that I would go nuts over being like, oh my gosh, if this thing happens, I'm gonna go crazy. I suppose this is a reason for that 2-drop to exist, but like if you get them both together, then I guess you run the 2-drop, but what's his name? Go back to him real quick. Vran. Yeah. So you can drain them for 4 instead of 2. And then smash them with your 8-3. Because that's a stat line. I think it's a +1/+0 Yarok. So interesting, you know. Big power. I like this card. But that's a personal feeling more than anything. I don't know that it's necessarily good. Next up, we have Gulping Scrap Trap. This is a 5 mana 4/4 Phyrexian horror. When it enters the battlefield or dies, proliferate. Okay. Yeah. That's a card. I like it. It plays a lot. It plays with basically all of the black archetypes. It's a proliferate thing. It has a death trigger. It is just a 4/4 as well for 5, which is not terrible. Like it's reasonable. It's probably solid. Next up, we have Kinzu of the Bleak Coven. This is a 5 mana, 5/4 legendary creature, Phyrexian vampire. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life and exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 1/1 and has Toxic 1. This is kind of excellent. Yeah, this is kind of excellent. Very fun, in the vein of Radadabarik, which is a card that was based on legendaries. Like, it only triggered for legendaries. This is everything. It doesn't give them like ward, but it makes them 1/1 toxic ones. So it's quite nice. I like this card. I think it's quite powerful. if you have powerful cards in terms of their abilities, uh, you know, it's going to be quite good. Now, it doesn't take into account stats, so that's not great, but they can't just give you everything for free. Next up, we have Nimrazor Paladin. This is a 5 mana, 4/4 Phyrexian Knight with Toxic 2. When Nimrazor Paladin enters the battlefield, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This is very nice. Like, just card advantage by rebuying creature plus a solid, a solid body in a 4/4 for 5. Solid card through and through. The Toxic 2, I don't think is going to be super relevant, but it's there. It's something that's there. Next up, we have That Emergence. It is a 5 mana sorcery. Put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Proliferate. Okay, so 5 mana reanimation is usually not good enough. It's usually just not good enough. I don't think this is going to break the mold in any way. We haven't seen, like, on top of that, nothing is beyond 5 mana or 6 mana in this set as far as we've seen. Like, this is where it tops out, so I'm going to pay 5 mana to rebuy my 4-drop and proliferate? Probably not. Probably not good enough to run. So yeah, that is what it is. Next up, we have Cruel Grimnarch. I know I did say things top out at 5, but they top out at 6. So we have a 5/5 Phyrexian Cleric with Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you gain 4 life. I think this card is bad. This is a 6 mana Bugler Rats, right? Like, and maybe you gain some life. Maybe they've been sandbagging a land and you just made them discard a card that wasn't actually a card. Yeah, it is a 5/5, which is about the biggest thing we've seen in terms of power and toughness. Like, we've seen an 8/3 and a 6/6. Okay, so it's not the biggest thing we've seen, but it is relatively large. I still think it's not good. I still think this is a not good card. Yeah. I'm going to stick by that. It's not good. Next up, we have Vraska, Betrayal's Sting. This is a 6 mana planeswalker that is 4 black, Phyrexian black. It has the completed mechanic, which says if you pay that Phyrexian black with life, you will get 2 fewer loyalty counters on this planeswalker. That is not how it's phrased in rules text, but that's how it plays. Okay? This planeswalker has a starting loyalty of 6. That is, if you play it for 6. If you play it for 5, it is a starting loyalty of 4. It has 3 abilities: 0, draw a card, lose a life, proliferate. So effectively a +1, but that's not part of the cost, that is part of the effect. Because they didn't want it to be an effective +2, right? So it is effectively a +1, draw a card, lose a life. There's a little bit upside there in that it is not actually a +1, it is a 0 ability that is proliferate, but that's how it plays out. Next up, we have a -2. Target creature becomes a treasure artifact with tap. Sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and loses all other card types and abilities. Wow. That's just a hard removal. Becoming a treasure, slightly worse than just being exiled or being dead. Right? So I think I would much rather have it just be, have an opponent's creature just be dead or exiled than become a treasure. But that's pretty solid to just turn it into a treasure. Last ability, -9. If target player has fewer than 9 or poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. And here I'm going to rely on an old adage that says, almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Same thing with Vraska Betrayal's Sting. -9 does not say win the game, and it is not easy to get there. If you play this for 6, you're going to have to activate the 0 ability and or proliferate 3 times to get to -9, which means that it is happening pretty much at its earliest on the turn after. Well, yeah, okay. So I guess the earliest this could happen is the turn after you play it if you have 2 proliferate cards in hand and activate its ability. You activate its 0 ability on the turn you play it, and then have 2 cards which cause it to proliferate in hand. Yeah. So you could pop that the turn after you play it, but then you sack your Planeswalker to put 9 poison counters on them, and maybe not even 9 because you were already playing toxic stuff. So maybe it was like 3, maybe it was 2. Like, hopefully it kills them, but it's still just almost. And that is the end of Black. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all thought it was interesting and informative. If you have a differing opinion, again, I say, I offer that you should go ahead and share that in the comments, particularly if I missed something, some synergy, some mechanism, or combo, which makes one of these cards better or worse than maybe what I was thinking. And I hope to see you next time, I guess. So, have a good one.